if you juice a plant, if you juice those vegetables and you don't put in something sweet like fruit or just, straight up sweeteners and sugars and things like that, it tastes awful. And it is absolutely ghastly how bitter and awful it is. Why do we think that we have that natural instinct to abhor the taste of something that is good for us? Why would we be designed to hate the taste of something that's good for us? Now, things can taste good because there are very clever scientists that have taken advantage of something called evolutionary traps, which we have this little signal of this thing's like, ooh, that's a good thing. We want to eat that.
This episode is for entertainment and information only. The opinions expressed are not professional advice, and listening does not create a client relationship. Always consult your own qualified professional before making any financial, legal, or health decisions.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I have a very special guest today. I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and he is a big proponent of the carnivore diet. And as you know, I like to talk about wealth and health and wellness in general. And this just seemed like a really good fit because, we live in a society that, we've been living by the food pyramid for so long now, and our society has only gotten worse. So seems like a back to basics approach seems to be a good choice for that. So with no further ado, let me introduce you. Welcome to the show, Dr. Chaffee.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I obviously seen you on social media. Instagram was where I kind of found you. And I really, started watching your stuff and I really enjoyed it. But tell the people that maybe haven't seen you before, kind of how you got going on this and, what your accolades are, et cetera.
Well, I'm a medical doctor. I'm originally from the US, but I've lived in Europe and now Australia. And I've always been interested in medicine, but I've also played high-level sports. I was an All-American rugby player. I played professionally for years before medical school. And, as professional as it was in the US, but then I actually, played overseas as well.
Okay.
Um, I was always interested in nutrition. I always understood that that was a major part of health. I mean, it goes back to Hippocrates, let food be thy medicine, medicine thy food. If he actually said that, who knows? But that was something that I was always raised with. My parents were always, very, very insistent that the food that you ate mattered and that certain foods could cause disease, things like that. So it was a concept that I was well familiar with. It's just that we were told sort of the wrong things. And as I started studying this more and more and more, I started to realize that the standard recommendations were just getting us to where we were. People were listening to this. People can say that, well, only 9% of people follow the guidelines. Well, only 9% of 9% of people in America follow the guidelines. Well, only 9% of people in America are diabetic. So there you go. And the thing is, though, is you can see in your own life people around you trying to eat more so-called healthy towards a food pyramid, less meat, less fat, more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, all that sort of stuff, more fiber. It's not helping their health, it's hurting it. And the people are getting fatter and sicker. And we've become fatter and sicker than we've ever been in human history. And we can see that very, very clearly over the last 40 years, even though the consumption data shows just as clearly that we've been eating less meat, we've been eating less fat, we've been eating more fruits and vegetables with fiber and whole grains, and also more sugar and more seed oils, over 3 times as much. So I fell into this sort of accidentally because I had a professor that was very clear that plants had toxins, naturally occurring toxins, and we know this as biologists that the plant kingdom makes about 1 million different defensive chemicals to stop animals and insects from eating them. We have classified them, categorized them, and quantified them. So this isn't a secret. This isn't a guess. These are known quantities. And we forget that because we've been told for decades that these things are just universally healthy. There's nothing wrong with them. Everything's better. The more fruits and vegetables you eat, more fruits, and that's always what you hear. You eat more fruits and vegetables. When you eat more, which fruits and vegetables? Because they're different and they have different toxins. And people that eat, the same thing over and over and over again, they can actually get a buildup in these toxins. Liam Hemsworth, the actor, actually put himself in the hospital with acute oxalate poisoning because he was eating spinach smoothies every morning for 3 weeks, and he almost killed himself. Right.
Wow.
So that's serious, and we need to be able to understand that and respect that. So I had a professor who was very clear about this, that was a professor of cancer biology during my undergrad at University of Washington, and he said very clearly that these plants were toxic. They were designed to be toxic by nature, and they could also be carcinogenic. It's a cancer biology class. So he started pointing out that these toxins could cause physiological distress and damage that could later precipitate cancer, so a carcinogen, and that Brussels sprouts had over 136 identified carcinogens at that time, back in 2000,
Wow.
2001, and that mushrooms had over 100, that spinach, kale, lettuce, celery, cabbage, cucumber, broccoli, everything, all the produce items that you've ever seen in your life. We were given lists of these things as a handout, that had a number and had 60, 80, over 100 known carcinogens in them. So this was quite startling, and in fact, we knew they were quite abundant too, because work from Professor Bruce Ames at UC Berkeley back in the late '80s, early '90s, where he basically was defending the pesticide industry, because people were blaming pesticides for a lot of people getting ill, because we radically changed the way we ate in the '80s, and people started getting sick. And so everyone says, it must be these pesticides because the vegetables are so good, but there's these poisons that we put on them. All right. Well, actually,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, well, yes, the pesticides we spray on them are poison. I mean, that's why we spray on them, so it can kill animals and insects trying to eat our crop. And then we go and eat that same crop, and what do we think is going to happen? But what we forget is that we don't have to spray pesticides on forests or fields or nature, because the plants make their own pesticides. And so that's what Professor Ames found and showed, was that the natural toxins, the natural pesticides and insecticides naturally occurring in the plants outweighed the pesticides that we sprayed on them by a factor of 10,000. So as he said, 99.99% of the pesticides and insecticides are naturally occurring in the plant. And they were actually worse than the pesticides we were spraying on them. He looked at, these were all in preclinical trials, so using animal models. And so he found that the toxins found in mushrooms were hundreds of times more likely to cause cancer than the pesticides that they were investigating at the time, called ALAR. And so this is why we still have things like ALAR. We didn't ban all these sort of things, because he showed that the plants themselves were far more toxic and had far higher prevalence of these toxins than the pesticides we were spraying on them. And so that's what the data showed. What he concluded was, well, since we know fruits and vegetables are so good for you, obviously the pesticides can't be all that bad, right? That is a value judgment that is not borne out by the data. He'd had no data in those studies to say that fruits and vegetables were good for you, posed a positive effect in people's health, or that these toxins were not toxic to us. What he showed was that there's 10,000 times more toxins naturally occurring in plants, and they're hundreds of times more carcinogenic than known poisons that we put on plants to knowingly kill animals and insects. So he had a lot of good science, but then he finished it off with a bunch of assumptions, which is the saying about assumptions: you make an assumption, you make an ass out of you and me. So, but
Right.
this is what people are focusing on. When I speak about that trial, they'll say, "Oh, but he concluded that that they're still good." Like, yeah, he can conclude whatever the hell he wants. His data showed that the plants are way more toxic. And then we had glyphosate, and that was after that. That was like in '93 that came in the food supply, and that's 50 times worse. If you who knows how
Right.
much times worse, but it's worse. And so that this wasn't compared against that. I mean, if these toxins were compared against glyphosate, maybe it wouldn't stand up the same way. But certainly for the pesticides at the time, like ALAR, it was far worse, far worse. And so that blew me away. And I remember him saying to us that he didn't eat vegetables or salad. He wouldn't let his kids eat vegetables or salad because, in his words, plants are trying to kill you. Why would you knowingly go along with this? They have known toxins that they're putting there in order to kill, injure, and disrupt animals trying to eat them.
Yeah.
And you don't just walk into something like that. You need to understand that and understand what's going on. So I just completely stopped eating plants at that point, and I defaulted into just eating eggs and meat. I didn't think about it as doing a specific diet. I just my entire litmus test was like, is it a plant? Not a chance. That was it. That was it. If it came from a plant, I
Wow.
was not going to eat it. And mushrooms would be in that too. So plants or fungus, and that was it. And I've never felt better in my entire life. I never performed better, played better, had better, you know, better results scholastically. It was just an absolute night and day difference. When I was playing professionally in England, um, I sort of slipped off of this because some of the meat was breaded, and I just sort of convinced myself, wow, dose makes the poison, so maybe it's not all that big of a deal. It's like, yeah, dose does make the poison,
Yeah.
but the dose is really small. It is not much. And that was enough, just a little bit of breading on some of the chicken a few days a week. That was enough to really curtail my performance and how I felt. I had a lot more inflammation and joint pain, back sore. I was like, what is going on? What's wrong with my body? I'm just falling apart. I didn't have any of this stuff. You get injuries, things like that, but I wasn't just achy and sore all the time for years. I mean, for 5 years, as a high end athlete, like that's unheard of. That you're not
Oh,
just constantly achy and sore. And all of a sudden, I was again. So I thought there was something wrong. I thought I was getting injured. I thought this little pulled muscles and a pulled groin. I thought there was like some sort of injury that just wasn't going away, and I might need surgery because like this thing's just not resolving. It's just a pulled groin. It's nothing, but
wow.
it just had this sort of pain lingering on, and I didn't understand it because it hadn't been there for so many years. And so I sort of slipped off at that point. That was the worst thing is when you reintroduce something, you've convinced yourself that it's okay. Now you convince yourself that other things are okay as well. And I sort of went back to how I was raised. It was a very meat focused, omnivorous diet. Very clean, never ate processed food, junk food. And that's the other thing. It's the only reason that people get benefits by going carnivore is because they get rid of all the junk food. I never ate junk food, never eaten junk food, more than like one meal every so often. I mean, I think I've had Kentucky Fried Chicken. I could count on one hand how many times I've had Kentucky Fried Chicken. You know what I mean? So it's Popeyes. I'd have to count on two hands, but you know, um, still not much. And so, never was big into processed food. And so many other people are coming from clean omnivorous diets, clean keto diets, clean vegetarian or vegan diets, and massively improving when they do this. So that, that's just a nonsense. And so eating very cleanly, mostly meat, but lean meat because you're supposed to eat lean meat, and just eating a salad because you're supposed to eat a stupid salad. That was basically my diet for another 12 years after that, until I sort of came across information that showed, well, hold on a second, well, humans actually are carnivores. I mean, because we've been apex predators for millions of years. Apex predators, by definition, eat a lot of meat, right? Because they're
Right.
apex predators, So you need to be a predator. You don't get you're not a predator of grass or cabbage, right? We're talking about predating other animals. So, um, and that's just our biological history. And if you look at any species, what they should be eating is what they've been eating the longest, and that's what should be the most beneficial for them. We know this for animals in the zoo. We've forgotten this with our pets, but we have definitely erased that for our own selves. And but that made sense to me, and I said, hold on a second, that's what I was doing for 5 years. I wasn't eating anything except meat and eggs. I even asked myself, I was like, ooh, should I be taking a multivitamin or eat a banana every now and then for the vitamins? But I remember thinking to myself, well, I feel good, my gums aren't bleeding, so let's just see what happens. Let's just ride
Well,
this out.
and I think that kind of brings up the point is like you were like not only eating this way, but you were performing at a high level of
Hmm.
athletics too, right? It's like I
Yeah.
think people, they think like I need this stuff because I need that energy, I need the sugar, I need the carbohydrates, I need it to kind of perform. But like here you are, in a carnivore diet, performing at one of the highest levels. I mean, rugby,
Mhm.
I played football for 9 years. Rugby is
Yes.
way beyond football. It is so cardiovascular intense and so aerobically and aerobically
Mhm.
intense. And so the fact that you weren't eating any sort of carbohydrates during that time, I think that kind of puts to rest that you need them.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. No, yeah, I always sort of thought about it as endurance sprinting. You have to, it's a dead sprint the whole time, and you have to just keep going. You just have to keep sprinting the whole time, especially for my position. I played like open side flanker and number 8. So that was especially then because now they sort of changed how things are played a little bit. But back then, if you were playing number 7 or number 8, you had to just be up and down the field, back and forth, just hitting everything all the time. I was making literally more tackles than anybody else on the field by a country mile. And I didn't actually like other people making the tackles. I wanted to hit every single person every time. And so, I just go up and smash someone, get up and just go head hunting and just try to get the next guy and the next guy and the next guy.
Yeah.
So it was, I'd dead sprint to smash somebody, hop up, dead sprint to the next guy and smash them too. And that was it. That's how I played for 90 minutes. And yeah, you
And for years, and
can't
for
do that
years too.
for years and years. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yeah, as a carnivore for 5 years,
Yeah.
and playing at a very high level. And so all highest levels in North America, I was playing just sort of internationally, played in the US and Canada and England, and various tours in other countries as well for sevens and 15. Sevens is even more of a track meet because that's like the same size field, which is actually wider than a standard American football field. It can be 40 to 60 meters wide.
Wow.
And so it's actually can be wide as hell. So depending on the field, and then 100 meters long. So instead of 100 yards, a bit longer. And in sevens, like normal rugby's has 15 players. Sevens is, as its name just sort of suggests, it's only 7 players. So you have half the players on the same size field. So it's just wide open space. It changes the whole dynamic of the game. So you're not the same sort of tactics, and you just got one guy, and you've got all this space. So you've got to really cover a lot of space, and they've got to cover you too. So it's just a dead sprint the whole time. It's just like a
Oh,
track meet. So if you needed carbs to do that, that wouldn't work. And so I played it, all the highest levels, select sides with the U.S. was, getting looked at for, selection to the U.S. national team as well, and sort of just on the cusp of that as well. So, you know, if you needed, if you needed carbohydrates to do these sorts of things, it would never have happened.
right. Well, and I want to mention, I want to go back to like you had mentioned with Liam Hemsworth.
Mhm.
Like, how did they ultimately find out that it was the smoothie that was causing the problems?
I believe the main, well, you have different sorts of things. I mean, we do know about oxalate poisoning. It's been actually been in the medical literature for hundreds of years. You actually see this going back quite a way. I mean, there's nutritionists like Adele Davis 100 years ago who said you never eat raw spinach. In fact, there's a lot of people for hundreds of years saying you never eat raw produce at all whatsoever because you have to cook it, denature it, um, cook it, ferment it, mix it with different chemicals like lye and all these other sorts of things to denature and lower the toxic load of these plants and make their nutrients more bioavailable. That's another way plants defend themselves. They just lock up their nutrients and vitamins in ways that we don't have the enzymes to break down, which is how we're not designed to eat them because we don't have the machinery to actually extract these nutrients without fermentation or cooking or all these other sorts of things. You can eat raw meat and get absolutely everything out of it. So um, this has been known for a very long time. It's only very recent they said, "Oh yeah, raw food, this, that, and the other." We've never done that. We've never done that. And it's not good to do that. If you are going to eat plants, you need to cook them, you need to ferment them, you need to denature them, do the things that these traditional recipes that go back thousands of years. There's a reason they exist, is because they can lower the toxic load of these plants, and that's why we prepared them in that way. So spinach, for example, was never eaten raw, ever, right? Um, well, it was recommended never to eat it raw anyway. You would poach it in milk and the calcium would leach out the oxalates because oxalates bind to calcium. They bind to other minerals as well. People may know that if you have like rust on the side of your house, you get rust stains on your clothes or something like that, you put a little bit of oxalic acid, oxalates in the water, and spinach has oxalates in the form of oxalic acid. And so put oxalic acid in water, then you scrub or wash the rust area with that, just strips it right off. Just comes right off. That's because the oxalic acid binds to the iron and just goes away. It does that in your body too. So it strips out iron from your bloodstream. It strips out iron from your food, so you can't absorb it. Also does this with calcium. There was a study in, I think it was 1950s. They gave people, and this is the thing. You put these things through a mass spectrometer, you can see, wow, spinach has a lot of calcium. Good source of calcium. Or is it? So they gave a bunch of spinach to people and checked their calcium levels. In fact, their calcium levels went down, even though there's a lot of calcium in spinach. That's because the calcium is not bioavailable. It's bound up in ways that we don't have the enzymes to break down, so we can't access those nutrients. It doesn't matter if they're in there, they're not going to get in here, and that's the important thing. And it's also very high in oxalates, oxalic acid. And so that gets into your bloodstream, causes a lot of damage. They can crystallize in these little sharp needle-like projections, which actually damage tissue and like your kidneys, and binds to calcium and can strip it out. So now your calcium levels are going down. And then you have to leach calcium off your bones in order to keep your serum levels of calcium up, because if your calcium levels goes too far down, your heart stops and you die. So it's
Wow.
better to sacrifice your bones than your heart. And so this is well known, well described. I learned this. I mean, my second year as a doctor, I was doing an ER rotation, and a young woman came in with kidney stones, and I was talking to the attending about this, and it just said, ask her if she eats a lot of spinach. Spinach are really high in oxalates. 75% of kidney stones are calcium oxalate stones. And so a lot of people eat a ton of spinach because they think it's healthy. They get these kidney stones. And so that's a very common thing, right? Um, so with Liam, I think he had massive, massive kidney stones that ended up having to get surgically resected.
Oh,
So yeah, and
wow.
but people have just flat out died from acute oxalate poisoning. That's in
What?
literature.
So I'm assuming kale's in the same category as spinach. Like that's another like real standard for the smoothies and the juicers and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the funny thing about kale is there's all sorts of different toxins in kale, tons. And, oxalates are one of them, but there's so many more. I mean, plants just don't use one toxin at a time. They can use dozens or hundreds or thousands, right? So there's a lot for them to choose from. Some are going to be much more prevalent than others. So you have the nightshade family: potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. These have, they're called solanaceous plants. So they have more solanine and lectins, which are another category of plant toxin. There's thousands of different kinds of lectins. That's a category. And they can cause a lot of damage. I mean, this is, belladonna, deadly nightshade, tobacco. These are examples of the nightshade family. But potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, these are nightshades, but they're New World nightshades. You go back to Roman times, they're like, never eat nightshades. These are bad. You don't eat nightshades. Nightshades are toxic. And then when the European colonists and explorers came to America, they found there was agriculture in certain areas. It wasn't completely widespread over both continents. That's a myth. People say like, oh well, people were eating potatoes in very select areas. That was not broadly broadcast over the entirety of both continents. So in those areas like Mesoamerica, which is where this was thought to originate, they did eat these things, and they noticed them. And they were like, whoa, they're eating nightshades. What the hell is that? And they brought those back as curiosities, as just like, look at this weird ass plant. I mean, think about it. A tomato is a weird ass looking plant. Like that's not,
Okay.
it's not a normal plant. And so it wasn't a very normal European plant. They brought that back as a curiosity. Look at this strange plant. And we keep, rhododendrons and other sort of highly toxic plants because we think they're pretty. But you don't eat them. They're a decoration, right? And then they started noticing, well, these people are eating these things actually. It's usually out of necessity. The wealthy could afford meat, so they would eat meat. But other people's that maybe not could not afford this. But Um, but they did in very specific ways. Did you notice that up until like the 2000s, no one ate potatoes unless they were peeled? You got a baked potato, people gut out the inside of it and usually leave the skin. And then all of a sudden, TGI Fridays came out with potato skins, and that became like a thing you could order, and it was like loaded up with like cheese and sour cream and bacon. They're like, oh, potato skins aren't that bad. Those are throwaway items. They used to
Yeah.
toss those out because they were no good, because that's barrier protection. That's where a majority of these lectins and toxins and solanine is, right? So it's from the beginning, we would peel these things because that's what the natives did. You'd peel them off. It would only be ripe if they got green. You wouldn't touch them because they was exposed to air or sunlight, right? So all of a sudden it's hitting that. So they'd get green because they'd start making chlorophyll. But that triggered the plant to say, hey, we're exposed, something can eat us. We need to be more poisonous. They start upping up the toxicity of the tomato, or sorry, the potato. And or if the root starts growing through, I'm sure your mom told you, my
Yeah.
mom did anyway, you have to cut out the eye. You can't just cut off the root. You have to cut out the whole eye or just throw the whole thing out,
Right.
because it's much more toxic at that level, right? And so we learned this from the natives. We used this up until literally, 20 years ago. I remember this. TGI Fridays came out with potato skins. They're like, no one had potato skins. That was a thing that like in the back of the restaurant, when they would have these potato skins, they were like sort of just throwing them away. So people like worked in the restaurant in the kitchen. They just sort of they'd prepare them for themselves because it was just they were going to throw it away otherwise. And they started
Yeah.
saying like, well, these are actually pretty good. So why don't we sell these to people? And
Yeah.
and and then
My
everyone said,
grandparents owned a restaurant, and we did
mhm,
twice baked potatoes, which was basically
mhm,
where you take the potato out and then you kind of mixture it with cheese and sour cream and stuff like that and put it back in
mm,
the potato skin. So, but I mean, I think still people really in general didn't eat the skins. I mean,
yeah.
some people did because they eat everything, but
Hmm.
even then, it was more of like it was just sort of a display item than it was
Yeah,
an actual food item.
yeah, and that there's a reason for that, is because there's
Yeah.
more toxins in the skin, and so and this is why I mean in the Navy, I mean if you got in trouble, you were 2 weeks peeling potatoes, that was the thing,
Right. True.
and so then tomatoes, made tomato sauce. Oh, we've been using that for centuries. Well, really, it's a New World plant. So you're talking about how this is a traditional food of Italy and Spain. It's not actually. It's only a couple hundred years old, because they've only had tomatoes for a couple hundred years in Europe.
Right.
But they did it in a very specific way. And the traditional way of making it right now is you only take vine ripened tomatoes, because when they're picked green, they have much higher toxicity. Even when they're ripened in the box, studies have shown that toxicity doesn't go anywhere. It's a closed system. It can't go anywhere. The plant has to pull it out. They don't just dissolve into just harmless the materials. Those toxins stay there. And this is why in my lifetime it was said that you don't eat green tomatoes. Green tomatoes are poisonous, right? And then, the movie Fried Green Tomatoes came out. It's just an old wives' tale, and it's not that big a deal, right?
Right.
And but that was for hundreds of years. Don't eat green tomatoes. They're harmful. So they'd vine ripen them. They'd blanch them in water to take the skin off. Then they'd take the seeds out, and then they'd
Right.
boil the living hell out of the pulp that's left. That's what you do. That's tomato sauce. And that's how they would eat tomato. They weren't just eating tomatoes like apples or chopping up and putting it in a fresh salad. It was done that way to make a
Yeah.
sauce. And the skin had the more toxins, its barrier protection, and the seeds, most importantly, are the plant's baby, and everything protects babies more than anything. So it's seeds, beans, legumes, grains, nuts. All these things are the plant's baby. This is where you typically find the highest concentration of toxins. And so they had to take that stuff out. Then they had the pulp that was left over. It was vine ripened, so it at least had some reduction in the toxin, and you boil the living hell out of it. Lectins can be heat sensitive, and you can get a lot of them out, not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them out through heat exposure. So these are the things that we did to, lower these toxic load. Sorry, I went on about 30 tangents there, but you were talking about kale. So
Yeah.
kale, the interesting thing about kale is that this only showed up on the scene in about 2015, and that's because there was a lady, she owned I don't know if yeah, anyway, she's on the East Coast. She owned a marketing firm, and she just decided one day, I'm going to make kale a thing. And so she got Beyonce to wear a t-shirt or a sweatshirt in one of her videos that said kale with like the letters like from Yale. He went to like Kale
Oh, yeah.
University and things like that. You see people, rejects wearing this thing every now and then, with that stupid shirt. But doing that and then getting people to talk about it and like getting it in, high end fancy restaurants in Manhattan and elsewhere is like, ooh, kale, kale, kale. And they had this ad campaign. So like different, little talk shows and morning shows. Ooh, kale, kale's the new thing. They're being paid to do this. This is a marketing effort, right? And then it sort of grew on its own. And but it was like 2015. I hadn't even heard of a plant called kale before 2015. And that's what it is. Very interestingly, the number one purchaser and buyer of kale prior to this was actually Pizza Hut. And it was not to use for any food substance. It was used to line the outside of the salad bar, not for the
Oh,
salad,
yeah.
just to
Yeah.
line the salad bar to make it look all green and fresh and things like that. You don't eat that crap. It's just like
I
yard
remember that.
waste.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were the major purchasers. And the thing was that we tried actually feeding kale to livestock, but they had to stop because it was so toxic. So they
Mm.
used to give kale to sheep, and it started causing stillbirths, birth defects, growth, birth deformities. They'll get very sick. They get goiters. Goiter is an enlarged thyroid because it's dysfunctional and it's trying, and your brain's sending a lot of thyroid stimulating hormone down to your thyroid. It's like you need to make more thyroid, but it can't produce it. So it's growing big, 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 big because it's trying really hard, but it's not actually able to produce any thyroid hormone because of these. They're called goitrogens. They cause goiters, and kale's full of them.
Wow.
So there's an entire category of plant toxins called goitrogens, and kale is full of them. So this was causing massive goiters. It was killing the babies. They were getting congenital hypothyroidism, which can be very serious deformities, mental retardation in humans and animals, and death. And I've seen pictures of these poor little things, these lambs being born dead with a goiter the size of their head. It's just this big thing sticking out. And people can look up a goiter, Goitre, on the internet. Look for pictures of that. It's quite confronting. This big lump there. And so they say, okay, well, we can't do that because the thing is livestock, that's money, right? You start killing animals, that doesn't work. Okay, that stops. And but you give it to people are basically worthless. And so it doesn't matter. You just give it to them all they want. We're selling it to them. The end product doesn't matter if they grow up well, but you have specific endpoints. Like if those animals don't get healthy into weight and they're not having kids, you're losing money. The whole enterprise is losing money. So that has to stop. So they look at this very closely, and you can have actually very, very clear randomized controlled trials with thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals that are closely related and separate them and do one thing differently and see the results. We actually have quite human nutritional sciences are a joke. Animal nutritional sciences are extremely robust. So we gave kale to sheep, disaster. So we stopped doing that, started giving kale to dairy cows because they require a ton of feed
Right.
to make the amount of milk that, I mean, sometimes you do like upwards of 100 gallons of milk in a day per cow, right? So it's a lot of milk that they're producing. So you need a lot of feed. And they started giving that to dairy cows, and the milk from the dairy cows were giving the people who drank it goiters. So they had to stop
Oh,
that too. It was so
yeah.
goitrogenic. And so they just said, well, okay, we can't give it to sheep. We can't give it to cows because, we can't give it to sheep because it kills the sheep. We can't give it to cows because the milk causes goiters in people. So screw it. Just give it to people,
let's
It's like,
let's let Beyonce sell it to people.
well, that's it, because the thing is like that's why no one ate kale, wasn't fed to animals, and the major purchaser of it was Pizza Hut, right? And then
I
this
love that.
lady, had this sort of vegan bent and just wanted to push kale. She just wanted to make it a thing. And
Yeah.
whether she was being paid to or not, I don't know, but that was where that came from. But it's a highly toxic plant. It's not something you actually want to eat.
So what about like we talked about a little bit about smoothies, right? And the oxalates and stuff like that. So what about like places like where you go and get your cold pressed juice or like
Mhm.
I don't know much about juice, but I just know like there's juice and now there's cold pressed juice and it's but I mean typically the major categories are like kale, spinach, things like that. And then they use fruit to like make it taste so you can actually drink it, which is one of the
Yeah.
reasons I've always sort of stayed away from it. But anyway, tell me what you think about juice.
Well, you think about it, if you juice a plant, if you juice those vegetables and you don't put in something sweet like fruit or just, straight up, you know, sweeteners and sugars and things like that, it tastes awful. And it is absolutely ghastly how bitter and awful it is. Why do we think that we have that natural instinct to abhor the taste of something that is good for us? Why would we be designed to hate the taste of something that's good for us? Now, things can taste good because there are very clever scientists that have taken advantage of something called evolutionary traps, which we have this little signal, this thing's like, ooh, that's a good thing. We want to eat that. They take that, they magnify it, they change that. You ever seen this thing that says natural flavorings? There's
What's
nothing
that?
natural about them. They're mimicking natural flavors. So it's this litany of chemicals that taste kind of like orange. That's what they mean by natural flavors. Is it tastes natural, tastes like something you
Oh.
would find in nature, as opposed to
Wow.
like a Coke or something like that. It's just its own thing. It doesn't mean there's anything natural in there. And so that's something that really fools people. Oh, it's natural flavor, so it's got to be natural. Well, first of all, arsenic's natural. Those goitrogens and kale are natural. So natural is not, the bar you want to set this by. But there's nothing natural about them. So I mean, you can even see it was on 60 Minutes a while ago, and they were interviewing these food scientists, and they say, yeah, what we do is we isolate these little chemical compounds that give this good, this tastes good signal, and then we change it and modify it so it gives it an even bigger taste response, and it goes away really quickly. So you want the next chip, the next bite, the next drink, right?
Mhm.
So it causes compulsion. You compulsively eat. So we have very clever food scientists that are making things taste good that shouldn't. But if something tastes bad, that's a pretty good indication that your body's trying to warn you against eating it. Deer don't go around eating the shitty tasting leaves, right?
Right.
Koalas aren't sitting there going like, God, I hate this. I just don't want to eat this anymore. They love it. They enjoy it. You ever seen a cow come out on like really fresh green grass? Their eyes are bugging out of their head. They're just chomping away at it. They're really, really happy that they're eating this stuff.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't taste bitter to them. If it did, they wouldn't eat it because that would be an indication that that could kill them. Even cows. I mean, cows eat grass and plants their entire lives, and they're very healthy doing that. But they only eat very specific plants because other plants will kill them too. And there's an entire field of veterinary medicine that talks about this sort of stuff. All these different diseases like big head, big tongue, limp neck, crazy cow syndrome. Those are all names of diseases that these livestock animals can get. But it's well known and described that this is actually caused by eating the wrong plant and becoming toxic from that plant, right?
Right.
And so the treatment is get them the hell away from that plant. You have certain plants that are in there, you take them out, you pick them, you get them the hell out of there. Normally they won't really eat them, but if it's like a younger cat doesn't really know, like, oh, what's this? It's new. Take a bite of it, and that's enough. They get very sick or they die, And so that's well known, and yet we forget that, or we've had that forgotten for us, that these plants have toxins, and those toxins can cause a problem.
So is there like, I mean, I feel like I'm loading the question up, but
Mm.
is there like any like juices that people should be drinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, meat juice, Maasai drink blood. That works really well for them. They're healthy as hell. Average 6'3", 6'4" adult male height. That's a hell of a lot taller than anybody else around. Post agriculture, pre agriculture, that's par for the course. you know.
Yeah.
And there's a study. Well, in some areas, if you go back far enough, especially when they're like hunting, mammoths and things like that, they were like 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", average. And there's a study that was published in 2001 called Tallest in the World, and they looked at original source material of actually a study that was done in the late 1800s with the Native Americans in the Great Plains. They found that the people in the Great Plains who traditionally were eating a bunch of bison and wild game because they could eat bison the entire year, the bison herds would come through. They'd scare a portion of those over a cliff. They'd all crash and burn. They'd have food for the year. They'd dry it up and make pemmican, and it was a high fat mixture. They'd take all the fat that they had, and sometimes you they would waste the lean, but they wouldn't waste the or not waste, but they wouldn't use the lean, but they would always use the fat. And so they mix up this dried powdered meat, and they'd mix it up with rendered fat, and that would make it 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein. So it's actually 80% calories from fat, and they would eat this the entire year. And so they were very, very healthy with this. They didn't get any of the chronic diseases that Europeans got, and they were way taller. So in the late 1800s, they looked at this and they looked at the people in the Great Plains. They found that as a whole, the people in the Great Plains were the tallest human beings alive on Earth. And in fact, in some places like the Cheyenne, they were even taller than that. And so they were on average 5'10" adult male height, and whereas the European stock were down at 5'5", 5'4", or less. And now it's 5'8" in America. Average adult male height is 5'8". You have like Netherlands, they might be like 5'10", 5'11", depending on what you look at. But the really interesting thing is that they eat a lot of meat in Denmark. But the really interesting thing about that study is that in that original source data, it said that the older generations of the Cheyenne and Plains Indians that they were measuring their height of to make the average, that like the grandfathers and great grandfathers, they were way taller than the fathers and the sons. And so they said if they'd done this study 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that average would be way higher than 5'10". And that's because when they did that study, that was already after the bison had been wiped out and they were put on reservations. So you're looking at the transition point, the inflection point from pre-agricultural society to a post-agricultural society, and they shrank immediately, and they've continued to shrink since then. And started getting all these chronic diseases that we get in Western countries, and they're actually much more prevalent because they're genetically predisposed to them because they haven't had 10,000 years of agriculture in their past. Mesoamerica, sure, not in the Great Plains of North America. And so, our European ancestors and other places around the world, agriculture came up independently in about 7 points around the world at different times. But if you're not descended from one of those people, then you're not going to have the genetic adaptation, at least partially dealing with these toxins for for the last several thousand years. So they're getting hit with this right in the face. And I mean, I was told this, I mean, it was on the news when I was a kid. I remember hearing this, and it really confused me because it said when eating a Western diet, Native Americans are 4 times as likely to get all the chronic diseases we get: obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmunity, all the rest. I remember thinking to myself, I was like, well, doesn't that mean the food is causing the disease? Because
Right.
we eat the food and we get the disease, we just get it at a lower rate. And if they don't eat the food, they don't get the disease.
Right.
We get this too. So, what were they eating that we weren't, and vice versa? What's a Western diet? What the hell did that mean? Well, no one said it at the time, but they were carnivores. They were just eating meat. They weren't eating a lot of plants, if any. And so this is well described in current anthropological textbooks and papers that pre-agricultural societies alive right now do not get any chronic diseases or any problems like that, and they absolutely live as long or longer than we do in the West if they die of old age, if they get past infancy, really, because there's a high infant mortality rate. So they say, oh, well, people die in their 60s. Well, people are getting heart attacks in their 20s and 30s now. So that's not saving anybody. And so if it was meat that was causing this, we should be seeing them getting heart attacks, them too. They don't get any of these chronic diseases. Oh, we're just living so long that we get these chronic diseases. No, 10-year-olds are getting type 2 diabetes, 17-year-olds are having heart attacks, 26-year-olds are having strokes. No, this is not the case. And
and then I mean,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, you kind of had mentioned like like they're trying to always feed the cows and the sheep, and they're starting to feed this stuff. I've noticed like one of the things that I kind of dawned on me a while ago was like this like lends itself to the grass-fed industry, the pasture-raised chickens and stuff like that. was like, well, if it's not good for me to eat soy and corn and flour and all the things, rice, like, why
Mhm.
are you giving it to the animal that I'm going to eat?
Yeah, it's not good for
And
them
then
either.
we now know that that's not good for them either.
Mhm.
But like, people say, oh, it's so expensive for grass fed. And it's like, well, it is if you go to like the most expensive market and try to get it at your
Mhm.
butcher. But like if you find the local guy who's growing, cattle or whatever, they're usually pretty reasonable. You just might have to order a half a cow or something. So I mean, what
Yeah.
do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, when any animal eats what it's not designed to eat, it can have problems, either not getting the requisite nutrition or it's going to be exposed to these toxins. We put cows in feedlot because it causes, insulin resistance and diabetes and fat deposition, because as you eat carbohydrates, your insulin goes up, and fat and insulin is the fat storage hormone. So the higher your insulin goes, the more fat you store in your muscles, subcutaneous tissue around your organs, in your organs. We wonder about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that just sort of showed up since the 90s, and we're like, oh, what's going on here? There's always alcoholics before this, and it's just like, okay, well, how do you get it in a duck? How do you make foie gras? You stick a tube down their throat and you pour in grains, right? So people are pouring grains down their own throat. They don't even need a feeding tube. And we wonder what's going on. Well, you have high insulin, you're going to get fat deposition throughout your body. You get myosteatosis, which is fatty deposition inside the muscles. Even have bodybuilders say, you need carbs to bulk up. No, you're eating carbs. And yes, you could put glycogen and pull water into your muscle as well, but that's not muscle. But you're also depositing fat. You're getting myosteatosis. And we see this on MRI. That's why it has a name, myosteatosis. And myosteatosis is strongly associated with severe metabolic dysfunction and chronic disease. And and all sorts of other problems, pain. If you have myostenosis down the paraspinal muscles, when you see that on a spinal MRI, that's a much higher association with back pain. And I saw at a conference of spinal surgery, they discussed that, and they said if you're evaluating a patient for a fixation, fusing the spine because they're in a whole bunch of pain, all sort of stuff. If they have myostenosis, a lot of myostenosis in those muscles, they have very, very, very poor outcomes. As far as pain is concerned, it almost never cures their pain. So there's something else. There's metabolic issues there, but that's myostenosis that comes from carbohydrates, and in cows we call that marbling. And how do we get marbling? We give them a whole bunch of grains, and that raises their insulin, and you get fat deposition in the muscles. Like, this is not new. We know this, we do this, we utilize this to our advantage from a culinary perspective. But but we're doing it to ourselves, and we have no idea. Oh, we don't know why someone has myostenosis. We see his association with people who are metabolically sick. Yeah, because carbs make you metabolically sick, and it also causes you to deposit fat. But yeah,
Well, like
so you
Wagyu.
don't. And Wagyu, yeah,
Wagyu is
yeah.
supposed to be like it's supposed to be the premium cut of
Mhm.
meat, but it's because they give it beer and grain like nonstop.
That's it. And we're eating pizza and beer, and we wonder why we're fat. But it's
Right.
vegetarian, and obviously, it's low fat, everything's fine. We have just been completely um, fooled by the food and drug
Yeah.
companies, who have just been telling us for decades that fat is the enemy, meat is the enemy, because it protects their products, because their processed food products are what were destroying people's health. And they were like, well, can't have that. And so they paid off a bunch of people to make people look in the other direction. And this is not a guess. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a published fact. The Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, one of the top medical journals in the world, they published actual internal memos in 2016, actual internal memos from the sugar companies back in the 60s and beyond, detailing how they were paying off professors from Harvard and elsewhere to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies to make it appear as if cholesterol caused heart disease, when it's much more likely to be sugar. There's a big debate going on for decades about whether it's cholesterol or sugar. And one of those professors from Harvard was named head of the USDA, and he was the one who authored and published the USDA declaration in the late 70s saying that cholesterol causes heart disease, end of story. And that changed everything. And so
Yeah.
we stopped eating fatty meat, which we'd been seeking and searching for and going after since humans have been humans, because now it was causing a disease that had never existed prior to that century in any real number. Do you know the first confirmed death from a heart attack in America, proven on autopsy, was in 1912?
Wow.
And did you know that in 1920s, it became the number one killer in America? And we were eating less meat in the 1920s than we were in 1912. And we
Yeah.
were eating in fact, in the 1920s and 30s, we were eating the least amount of meat in 200 years of American history. So prior to that, we were eating far more meat, far more fat, butter, and lard. Seed oils didn't exist. Crisco didn't exist before, and that came on the market in 1911. That was a machine lubricant that was developed by the German military to lubricate their U-boats and tanks. And then Procter and Gamble bought the technology of hydrogenating vegetable oils and seed oils, and just said, yeah, we can just feed this to people, and they'll just eat it.
Yeah.
It's like, and it was absolutely mad. It just, it's the funniest thing. I mean, you even have it now. You have this thing called grass, generally recognized as safe, and so the FDA doesn't even look at it. Well, it's grass, so don't worry about it. They don't decide what's generally recognized as safe or not. The industry gets to put their own label on it, and they say, yeah, well, this is generally recognized as safe, so don't worry about it, FDA. No problem, guys. You're so good, saving us work. That's insane. This is a regulatory
Yeah.
body that is in theory there to protect people, but no, they're actually protecting corporate interests because they get 66% of their budget from those corporations. And people don't know that, but that's actually the case. And so and then there's this revolving door. People that are high up in the FDA do all these little deals for drug companies, food and drug companies. As soon as they finish at the FDA, bam, they're on some executive board somewhere getting paid millions
Right.
by that company that they were making billions for. It's an absolute con game. And the fact that these industries are allowed to say what's generally recognized as safe or not is absurd. And so they basically get to put anything in our food supply, any additive, any this, that, Bovaer, all that sort of nonsense. We just said, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Right.
How do you know that? Did we test it at all? We didn't test Crisco. That was never shown to be safe. But it's heart healthy, and the American Heart Association supports it and says it's heart healthy. So obviously they wouldn't just say that, would they? Except
Right.
that the American Heart Association is a private organization. It's just like, I believe it was like 5 cardiologists. Now heart disease was just becoming so prevalent. They're like, ooh, we should probably have a society for this one disease that never existed before. And
Right.
um, and so they made the American Heart Association. It's a very obscure little group, a couple guys, playing D&D in their basement or something like that. I mean, it was just like, it was a very obscure sort of group, but they were the first ones to do it. And all of a sudden they blew up to national prominence because they got this huge influx of money, of cash.
Right.
And that was because Procter and Gamble paid them the equivalent of $20 million in today's currency to just make a blanket statement saying that Crisco and vegetable oils, polyunsaturated fats were heart healthy and good for your
Right.
heart, and that butter and lard and animal fats, bad for your heart, based
Yeah.
on no evidence. There was no study, there was no science, there was no data, there wasn't even like a survey. It was nothing. It was purely just a statement. And that launched them to national prominence. And they were able
Wow.
to do whatever they wanted. So they have their origins in fraud and being
Right.
bribed, and that it didn't stop there. Okay, well now we got it, so we'll do it right this time. No, they don't. They don't do that.
Right.
They are known to have been paid off by the sugar companies and the processed food companies multiple times after that. They misrepresented the Framingham study, which I was taught in medical school. Almost every medical professional was taught in.
I was a pharmaceutical rep for 10 years. That was
There you
huge for
go.
us too. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Framingham study, which is an epidemiological study, it's a prospective cohort study, not an interventional trial, not a prospective interventional trial. You're just following a bunch of people and seeing what happens and trying to make some correlations with things. And what I was taught, I'm sure what you were taught and then taught people, was that increased cholesterol was associated with higher cardiovascular disease mortality rate, and vice versa, lower was lower. Um, but that's actually not what it found. The actual original Framingham study actually showed the opposite, that as you lowered total cholesterol, or cardiovascular disease mortality rates went up.
Wow.
And that was what was the original data. And then the American Heart Association misrepresented that and came out and said, oh, look at the Framingham study. It showed cholesterol going up is associated with cardiovascular disease. Now, correlation is not causation, but there isn't even a correlation. And so they lied. 2 years later, they published that. And that's what got into the textbooks, and that's what got into our classrooms. That has since been published by, I think it was by Ravenscoff et al. They actually showed that the original data did not show that's been published in the last 10 years, that was
So,
completely
so,
misrepresented.
so like I'm aware of this too, because again, I sold Lipitor, which was the number one prescribed statin at the time. And we had a little cube that showed like as your blood pressure went up and your cholesterol went up, your heart disease went up. We had this little, cube that we had to hand people. Um, and I mean, we know it's not true now. You know what I mean? We know it's
Yeah.
not true. And yet I still go to my doctor and he still says your cholesterol's too high. You need to be on a statin. And I think like, how did this information still not make it to them? And
Well,
then when you tell them like, hey, there's
yeah.
a study or there's a guy or whatever, they look at you like, oh, well, you're just getting you're going to an
Mm,
internet doctor. It's like they don't
mm,
take it serious. But I'm like, well, it's still studies.
yeah. Well, tell them, yeah, just what's going on there? Don't know what happened there. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, yeah. You drop for a second. So
Those are weird. Okay. So yeah, well, that's the funny thing is that, our education system in medicine and otherwise is completely controlled by the food and drug companies, completely. And so after, post graduation, it is as well. So, when you're going to a residency, this is dictated by the drug companies and things like that. And that's how we're taught. Here's a problem, here's a pill. And it's just a matching game, Yeah, you have this problem,
right,
or you have this problem, Ramipril. It's just like that's all there is, And you have, okay, you start with, an ACE inhibitor, and then you go to a this and a this and a this, and you go down the list on all these different sorts of things to try to fix the problem with a drug. Well, these problems didn't come about because they had a deficiency. Like cholesterol is not a statin deficiency. High blood pressure is not a Ramipril deficiency. Diabetes is not a metformin deficiency. These are not caused by a deficiency in something. Some things are. Hypothyroidism, you get your thyroid removed, you just need to take thyroid, right? You have type 1 diabetes, if you destroyed your beta cells, your beta islet cells, you will need to use an appropriate amount of insulin. There are issues that are like that, but we've been fooled into thinking they're all like that, and that
right,
so we have these problems, and now there's a new problem. Now there's that problem. Why is it a new problem? Why didn't this problem ever come before? Well, it's just one of those things. Let's try to find a drug. These smart people that figure out a drug for it. It didn't exist 20 years ago. So why
right,
don't we instead of looking for a drug to fix this problem that never existed before, why don't we try to figure out what changed to cause the problem in the first place? Wouldn't that be smarter?
right,
And so, but the problem is we don't get taught like that. We don't get taught to think like that. My great grandfather he was well, still to date the youngest ever graduate from Columbia Medical School. He was 20 years old, and that that was in the late 1800s. He was the second class at Columbia ever taught sterile practice. This was 5 years after anesthesia came on the market, so he was on the ground floor of modern surgery, where you could actually ethically open up the thorax and the abdomen, and without killing them, and just being a torturous event, and killing them with almost guaranteed sepsis. And that's how they approach things then. Okay, what happened? How do we figure out what's going on? And then we had this complete change in how we had things started becoming corporatized, and pharmaceuticals, and then you just started getting drugs that were just they figured out that who knows exactly when this happened, but there was a point where the drug companies figured out that just make a drug that just fixes something and alleviates pain or whatever, if you get something that like the birth control pill, for example, you can give this to them and then they just take it. They just keep taking it and keep taking it and keep taking it and keep taking it and keep taking it. You make a lot more money. And so if you now are just treating things from a chronic point of view, you're not trying to cure anything, you're not trying to get rid of anything. You're just trying to treat a symptom and you treat those symptoms for the rest of their life. Then you have a customer for life. It's drug dealer 101. You have to cook them early and then you keep them forever. And
Right.
so, there was a leaked set of missives from Goldman Sachs, and they said, is curing someone of a disease a viable business model? And the answer was, of course, no. Because you don't want to cure anybody of a disease. You want to treat the disease so that they can live with that disease for the rest of their life. And
Right.
that's a very, very lucrative situation. And so you're just treating people like chattel. You're just something you can enslave and just make money on for the rest of your life, of their life, which is a sick sort of slave master sort of mentality. And
I love that analogy. I think that's a very, very right on analogy. We are beholden to our corporate overlords.
mhm,
We're
yeah,
paying a third of our money to a half of our money in taxes, and the
yeah,
rest goes to the corporations, and
that's
maybe we
it.
have a little
Yeah.
bit left over.
Yeah, I'm paying for all these drugs and things like that. I mean, people go
Yeah,
into bankruptcy for their medical expenses and things like that. And a
yeah,
lot of these things you don't need. This is your
yeah.
lifestyle issues. That you change your lifestyle, you change your diet and your lifestyle, not in the
Right.
ways that
Well,
they suggest, because the way that they suggest keeps you fat, sick, and unhealthy and on their medications.
right. We are at an hour, so I want to be respectful of your time. But I think a great way to end this would be, and I could talk to you for hours. I mean,
Mm.
especially this topic is so good to me, so interesting to me as well. But a great way to end it would be like, what are like some like maybe three or four things that someone could do like today that would sort of ultimately change the way that their trajectory of health goes?
Well, you eat just more closely to our biological design. We have a biological design. I mean, there's a reason that there are signs at the park saying, don't feed bread to ducks because it gives them diabetes. If it gives a duck diabetes, what do you think it's doing to you? Signs in the zoo
Right.
say don't feed the animals because if they don't eat their natural diet, they get very sick. What do they get sick with? They get obesity, heart disease, liver disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmunity, arthritis, and osteoporosis. So, we know that for animals, and yet we have been blinded to that fact for ourselves. And so just go back to that. Think about, okay, what have humans been eating for as long as humans have been humans? It's meat. We had an agricultural revolution, and that revolutionized the way we ate. If we were eating a bunch of plants before that, it wouldn't be much of a revolution, would it? And right after that, the height, health, and brain size of people dropped dramatically, dropped on average 5 inches of height, 11% brain size for men, 17% average brain capacity for women, and teeth got crooked and rotten. We had signs of poor wound healing and chronic disease. We do not see that in pre-agricultural societies. Even post-agriculture in pre-agricultural societies, we don't see that. It's the food. It wasn't like just some sort of cataclysm, just God came down and went, "You're sick now." It was just those populations that started eating plants. And we saw this in real time with the Native Americans, the Australian Aboriginals, and other, the Maasai and others, and Inuit. In the last century, we saw this, the height of these three generations in the tallest in the world study showed that the older generations were taller. And then the grandfathers were the tallest, the fathers were next, and the children were shortest, right? That we were seeing that right there. We have Weston A. Price did a whole book on this, went to all these different native populations, saw it in real time. People in the same families were getting smaller jaws, crooked teeth, shorter stature, more health issues. And he reversed it by giving them a bunch of, animal fat and meat and raw milk, because there were all these nutrients what we need for facial development that only come in animal fat. They only exist in animal fat. Vitamin K2, D3, those sorts of things. They only come in animal fat, and you have to have those, calcium as well, and other sorts of things. But those are the main ones that we're missing. And he found you could give them that and reverse it in real time, and you could you had a grandfather, the biggest, strongest, healthiest, biggest jaw. The father was a bit smaller and weaker jaw. The grandson was way weaker, right? But you could breed back. You would start to do successive generations, things like that. You start feeding them properly, the jaws start growing, their bodies start growing. So, just
Yeah.
look at that. I mean, it is black and white staring us in the face. As I said with anthropologists, we see pre-agricultural populations. They don't get any of these chronic diseases. We know that they live as long or longer than we do. They get none of these chronic diseases until and unless they start eating a Western diet, and then they start
Right.
getting all these chronic diseases, right? And they go back and the problems go away. Why are we confused about what's happening here? The only reason we're confused is because we're being made to be confused. We're getting a lot of people being paid influencers, and I don't get paid by any industry. I just, I have a couple sponsors. It's clearly telegraphed, and that's it. And I'm very careful. I don't accept sponsors that don't fit with my message, and I generally don't do much anyway because I just don't like a bunch of ads. That's not why I'm doing this, but
Yeah.
it's very clear, that these people are being paid to say these things. We have multi-trillion-dollar companies and the food and drug companies that are spending billions of dollars. I mean, just Pepsi alone has a $2 billion marketing budget. That's why every single conference, medical conference and residency in hospital is sponsored by these people, right?
Right.
Because they can pay for it. And that's why your doctor has no idea that the research has moved on with statins, because drug reps aren't coming in to say, hey, all that shit that I said about statins, just forget it, but I'd still really like it if you prescribed it because it makes me money. They're never telling that stuff. They're telling them the studies that fit their narrative. It's all cherry picked nonsense. And you get lazy. You just get so sick of studying and taking tests, you just don't want to do it anymore. And a lot of people don't. But a lot of people do. A lot of people, if you're a responsible clinician, you stay on top of the literature in your field. And so there's a
Right.
lot of people that are coming around to this. And so hopefully more and more do as well. But just real quickly with I meant to say earlier, we were talking about how people aren't trying to cure diseases, and Goldman Sachs made that clear. There was a letter from Goldman Sachs to a company called Gilead that Gilead actually came up with something when I was an intern. I was like, really impressed by them because they came up with a cure for hepatitis C. Actually cured it. This is a chronic disease. People had to just take drugs for the rest of their life. They cured this, right? That's amazing. That's what they're supposed to be doing. That's what
Yeah.
we get told and thought, that this is what these drug companies are trying to do. All these really nice scientists are trying to save the world and cure these diseases. They're not trying to do that. And in fact, Goldman Sachs told them off and said, you really messed up by curing hep C. You should never cure a disease because you give them a dose once, that's it. There's no more hep C. Now we can't treat hep C. Now we don't have 50 years of hep C treatments and we lose money. So never do that again. And they basically, it's suggested, that if you don't make these people happy, they're not going to invest in you. They're not going to give money to you so that you can do more research and things like that. And so like, oh, okay, so they change their angles. But this is not going to come from them. We have to figure this out ourselves, and the easiest way to do that is just look at what people are being eating. How do we know what lions should eat in the zoo? Because you see what a damn lion eats in the wild. Okay, how
Right.
do we know what a human should eat? What does a human eat in the wild? What does an Inuit eat? What does a Maasai eat? What do the Nanette eat? What did the Native Americans eat before we slaughtered all the bison? Why did we slaughter all the bison? Because it was knocking out their food supply. And in any war, you cut off the food system. You cut off the food supply and your supply lines, and the army goes away and dies. Why are there over 1,000? Why were there over 1,000 chicken farms that burnt to the ground from arson a couple of years ago? Why is it
Yeah.
that meat processing plants have been getting torched and attacked with arson? Why are we saying that cows that have always been in nature, and we've had hundreds of millions of buffalo in the Great Plains of America, making it the most fertile and fecund land on earth, that's somehow now bad for the environment? That's destroying the environment. It's destroying the ecosystem. It's destroying our natural world, when it is the natural world. The natural world is plants and animals living in symbiosis. So why is that? Because they're attacking our food systems as well. And so we have this
Right.
this massive psyop that, and there's a guy who's a professor of psychology, and he said that he works with CIA, all these sorts of things. He said there's all these different points, if something's a psyop and being screwed up. But the one thing that is 100%, in medicine we call this pathognomonic. If you see this sign, it is that disease. There's no exceptions. That if you see this, it is a psyop. And that's if you are not allowed to dissent or to argue with if you say it's something else. And so, we say like, okay, well, cows destroy the environment. Well, actually, if you look at it, you are a science denier, you're a this, that, and the other denier. It's like that's a psyop. People are being silenced. This is not a scientific discussion. This is not trying to find what's best for people. This is a manipulation tactic. And when you want to take over an area, you cut off the food supply. That's what we did with the Native Americans. It worked really well. Now they're on reservations, and the land has been taken over, and the bison are all dead. And it's an absolute shame that happened. They're doing it still, and
Yeah. We're doing
and we
tough,
need to
man.
watch out for it.
Yeah. How can people get a hold of you or follow more about? I'll link to your Instagram and your social medias in this podcast and stuff. But what's a good place to get a hold of you and learn more about you, Dr. Chaffee?
Yeah, well, I have my social media. I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Anthony Chaffee, MD. Instagram is the same thing. And I have a podcast, which
Yeah.
is the Plant Free MD podcast. I do have a website, just sort of got it going. Um, and it's just, at the moment, it's called thecarnivorelife.com. And so people can check that out. I'll probably have it also linked in with my name as well. But for now, it's just thecarnivorelife.com, and you can sort of find everything on there. I have resources there. I have papers and studies and links to other lectures and other sorts of resources as well, if people want to go and take a look at this stuff as well.
Perfect. And I will link that in the description for you guys, but it's thecarnivorelife.com. So
That's correct.
I really appreciate you. This has been awesome for me, and I hope that my guests get a lot out of it as well. And I hope ultimately, I hope we make people healthier,
Yeah,
because everything that's coming at us is pretty wrong. So
it is. Yeah.
it's nice to hear the other side, and it really just, I mean, when you listen to it, it makes perfect sense. So,
Mm.
thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you, and hopefully we'll have you back on.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me. It's a
All right.
pleasure.
Thank you.